Welcome back to another devlog for Reading Room, a VR app that adds to the ambiance of reading physical books in the real world. Where we picked up from last time is we have a book that we can hold in our hands, and I've got a button here where I can toggle through pages of books that I've taken pictures of by hand and just load it in as test data. And so now what I'd like to do is take a moment, instead of making further improvements to the OCR of that text, see if we can improve the ambiance of the environment that we're reading in. So maybe get some ground, get some sky, and see if we can change something about the environment based on the content of the text being read. So let's get started on that. All right, so here we are. Now we have some ground and sky. I went and found a couple of add-ons. One of them is Sky 3D and Terrain 3D. They're both by the same company that's offering this as a free add-on for Godot. Terrain 3D is a bit more mature. Sky 3D they're still working on. The main reason I decided to go this route instead of building my own assets is, particularly with Sky 3D, it has dynamic sky, dynamic cloud, be able to change the sun on a moment's notice. And in fact, if you look here in the editor, you can see here on the right with the sky that the time is changing in the editor, which can be disabled. You can set minutes per day. You can see that the shadows are slowly moving. And so to build that out myself obviously would take a lot longer, and that kind of capability, the world being able to change, is something that I really want to have in this experience. Actually, it looks like the sun's setting right now, and so it's slowly getting darker in the scene here. One thing I added was that when we look at the code, page 1 and page 2, we are doing OCR on and putting them onto the page in the game. But I did an extra step here. This is just some prototype code where I go and grab the first half. So let's get the first half of the first page of text and then check to see if it's in our time of day list of words. And if it is, then call this time of day function, which if we look at that time of day function, it's a very simple logic for the moment. If the keyword's in night or darkness, then we set the current time to an enum value. Otherwise, we set it to noon. So just looking for, should we be nighttime or should we be daytime? And then we tell the sky add-on to increase its speed so that we change the time quickly. Once that's finished, on process, we will call update time. And this will be a check to figure out when should we stop moving the sky, since the sky is going to be moving quickly. Also, when we initialize the scene, we set it to noon, just for now. That update will check to see if we've gotten close to our desired time. So current time being the desired time that we want to get to. And if we're within like an hour of it, give or take, then we try to freeze time. Right now, this is a little buggy, obviously, because we're at the desired time, but time would still be moving. So some bugs there need to be addressed. But if I run this, press the button, it's OCRing the text, and the response should be coming back about now. And so there we are. We are switching the scene to nighttime because the text has words in it that reference night and nighttime. The next step now was to get this running on the VR headset. Now, previously when I had been running this on the headset, I would switch over to the compatibility renderer, plug in the headset, and then everything would run. The only issue is, if I switch to compatibility renderer, let's change it to noon. Look, the ground's gone. What happened? So the issue is that the Sky 3D add-on does not work well with the compatibility renderer. So we can't use compatibility, which made me realize, well, it's about time, with this basic functionality working here, it's about time to start getting this to a place where I'm generating APK files that I can install on a VR headset. Because one of the things that Godot lets you do is once you get a suitable export set up, and I went and did that, got the export working, is it gives you this little button up here. So if I plug in the headset I have, which I did finally get a Quest 3, and we plug that in, Now I have this button here to launch on the Quest 3, and that'll actually use the mobile renderer instead of the compatibility renderer. I set up an export. If we do an export for Android, a basic standard MetaQuest export from Godot to run it on the headset so that I could start generating APKs, install them on the headset, and be able to get the remote debugging working for the headset. That all went quickly as well. So again, moving along quickly with progress. The only issue then is realizing that the GD extension that I created, I had set up for building for Windows. Since running locally on the machine here, it would be a Windows build. And so the OCR GD extension that I created was generating DLL files to run C++ code on a Windows machine. That won't work on a MetaQuest, which under the hood is basically an Android phone. And so for an Android phone, we have to build .so or .a files, and that requires a whole different dev and build process. If any of you watched Devlog 0, you'll know that going down the path of building the OCR library was a chaotic and confusing, messy process. I won't bore you again with that process, but luckily, given that I've gone through it before, I'd already done it for Windows, things kind of made sense. I was able to move pretty quickly with figuring out how to build that version of things. However, Android is a little bit different in a number of ways, and building for Android on Windows specifically had some of its own challenges. There were obviously some changes I needed to make to the sconstruct file in order to support Android and get those libraries. So I had to build those libraries separately and bring them in. Actually, at the end of the day, the Android and Windows versions of the sconstruct file aren't that different, so I'll probably refactor this and clean that up. But aside from that, the only code change actually needed in the OCR library itself was where we get the data from, the test data from. And so out of the box, when you build an APK, those extra files don't get baked into the APK file. So I did have to improve Godot settings. We can go to Export, Resources, and we can provide a path to Godot to find that test data folder, which is what Tesseract needs in order to know how to do OCR with the English language dictionaries and other things that it uses. With that provided, the other issue being that even though that's in the APK file, you still don't have access to it as normal. So when running on Windows, this might not even be, not that this is ever going to be distributed on a Windows machine, so this is fine for local debugging, but I could easily just go find it locally in the file system here. In order for things to work for Android, we have to go extract those files from the APK, put them in a place on the VR headset, and then read them from there. So then the final step is being able to run it on both Android or Windows. And for that, we do a quick little check to see, hey, are we in a directory structure that sounds like Android? If it is, then go find the path for things. So then during initialization, we, instead of doing the hard-coded path to Windows like we had before, we call a function where we detect whether or not we're running on Android just by doing a simple directory check to see if the file system looks like an Android file system path. If so, then we try to load it in that way. Otherwise, we can still go back to the original test data folder on Windows like we were before. So with that done, now I think we can move on to probably the most important moment for this project up until this point, which is instead of loading in test images by clicking a button and doing OCR on a JPEG file that just sits locally, can I actually get it from the cameras on the Quest 3 VR headset? Earlier this year, Meta opened up the VR headset API to allow developers to get access to the Passthrough camera data directly, which is something you couldn't do prior to February-ish of 2025. For starters, that's only really available for Unity and Unreal, it seems. At least there's official support for those. I believe Godot support will come very soon, but it's kind of unofficial support. at the moment. And so now I'm going to take a stab to see, can I get access to the camera API directly myself? There is an experimental Godot add-on that someone has created to help with this. In theory, this extension would work. It would allow me to get access to the Camera 2 API for Android by requesting permission on the device. So I'm going to take a stab and see if I can get this working, and fingers crossed, we may finally be at a point where I can get rid of the table, I can get rid of the button, and actually just put on the headset, open a book in front of me, and be able to do OCR on text coming from the real world. So let's see if, here's that moment of truth. Let's see what happens.
One eternity later.
Okay, so I've been on a bit of a journey. Let's take a look at least the approach that I took, and then I'll show you where I ended up. So I started with the naive approach. I brought in that one plugin and checking for permissions being granted following the instructions from the plugin, requesting permissions from the operating system. When those permissions are granted, we ended up calling this method. We then go grab a feed, set its format, something that you have to do for Android especially, won't work without this. And then once we've done that, mark the feed as active. We can then create a texture, get the camera feed ID, and set that on our camera display, which, is just a thing that I put in the scene so that I could visually see that we were getting images coming through. And then the final piece of that being requesting permissions. So there's two permissions specifically we need: the Android camera permission and then the new headset camera permission. And so it took a little while to figure out, how do I request this permission? I thought I was going to need a new Android manifest and pass that in, which there is a way to pass a custom manifest file, but I went down that route, didn't really end up needing it, and then eventually realized you can just pass custom permissions. And actually, this was really all that was needed in order to get the permissions working. And nothing worked. I wasn't able to get a feed. I would get a black square. Nothing would be displayed. I took a bunch of time digging in. I ended up using ADB to inspect the permissions, or at least inspect the configuration of the app running on the Quest 3 headset. And from that, was able to dig into those logs and confirm that, yes, I was requesting permissions. Yes, permissions were granted. All of that seemed correct. And yet, things still weren't working. So my next assumption was, well, maybe I'm using this plugin incorrectly. So I resurrected an old Android phone project that I worked on a couple of years ago as part of prototyping this app that I'm building now. And so in that logic here, I've got two things. One of them is for displaying video. One of them is for a static image. And so I actually went even further and decided to go look at the old plugin that I'd used a couple of years ago that hasn't been updated in a few years, in addition to the new one I was using, and try to get both of them working on Godot 4.4, running on my Android phone locally, just to confirm that I've got the code working correctly to pull proper image data from the Android camera. And so that also worked. So actually, yeah, not a 3D project, 2D project. So that also worked. For both of those plugins, when I toggled between them, I was able to get still images. And for the one plugin, I was able to get video as well. And in that code, I ran through multiple experiments confirming that I could get both of those plugins working. So then with that working off my phone, okay, now I know that I've got the code written correctly. Let me update the 3D project code with what I'd learned from just working with a regular Android phone device. And again, under the hood, a Meta Quest 3 is just an Android phone with some extra things that Meta has done to it. So bringing that code over should have worked. But even with both plugins, still nothing was working. And so it was kind of at this moment that I definitely taking stock and realizing that, when I coach and advise the startups that I work with, I'm often telling them that you don't necessarily want to work with bleeding edge technology, because bleeding edge is where you're hurting. You want to be cutting edge, not on the bleeding edge. And I definitely found myself on the bleeding edge here. As I dug in, I decided to reach out to some of the Godot Discord and go reach out to this plugin creator, and I got some responses back, had some good conversations, and that's when I basically found out that as we speak, Android camera support for Passthrough API is in development, being added to Godot. In fact, part of that requires potentially, it seems like the likely issue is version 24 versus 21 for the NDK. And that might be the issue. I'll believe it when I see it with my own eyes. That's preventing it from working for me. And so as part of that, already merged 1 hour ago, a version bump for the SDK for Godot, and then the camera feed support for Android. So instead of needing a plugin, bringing that support native into Godot, also being actively worked on, and this will also probably get merged soon, I imagine, as well. And so definitely finding myself wondering if I'm spinning my wheels. Without this investigation, I probably would have been done 2 weeks ago with this dev update, and I could have moved on to other tasks and other things improving the app. But as it is, I now have to make the decision. I think I'll probably spend a little bit more time, take a quick stab to see if I can version bump the NDK and Android libraries on my end. It seems like Camera 2 API for Android might require 24, and maybe that's the thing that's keeping it from working. So I think I'll take another quick stab at that. But regardless of whether I succeed or not, I think now it's time to move on and assume that at some point pass-through support will be there. And in the meantime, I think there's other things I can work on, like improving the OCR quality, improving OCR performance, and then bringing more to the environment and starting to really flesh out the rest of this application. If you'd like to follow the project more closely, I stream at least twice per week to both Twitch and YouTube, where you can see me get deeper into the technical problems that I'm solving as I'm solving them. And I'll see you in the next one.